In this episode, I am talking with Katelyn Fusco of the Happy Homebirth Podcast to answer your questions about home birth. I put a question box on my Instagram and we got a lot of questions. I was excited for this one. Obviously, I shared my birth story at the beginning of the season, and I really enjoyed home birth, but I know that there's a lot of confusion. I think some myths and misconceptions around it. So Katelyn's going to clear that up for us. She is a home birth mother, a childbirth educator, and an experienced home birth attendant. She has seen birth from many angles, literally, and knows the impact this transformative event can have on you, your baby, and your entrance into motherhood for the first, second, or 15th time. This knowledge is what spurred Katelyn to create Happy Homebirth, a brand dedicated to supporting, educating, and encouraging home birth mothers. Through birth stories and expert interviews on the podcast to intimate education and coaching inside the Homebirth Collective, Katelyn's goal is to provide mothers with the tools to empower themselves in their birthing experience. And I love that you are transitioning to helping home birth mothers after they go through their birth experience as well, which I think is just as important. So thank you for being here, Katelyn.
Thanks, Amanda. I will say that I was listening to your podcast episode about your birth story before hopping on with you, and it was such a beautiful story. And I love that you shared how it wasn't some easy peasy, no big deal experience. I think the reality and the rawness of that is something that mothers are really yearning to hear. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, I can't tell you the reaction I got online of a lot of women, home birth or not, that did unmedicated births or even medicated, and they just were like, yeah, I did not. I thought I did all the preparation, all the hypnobirthing, which now I very much so question and would never do. All that kind of stuff, and they felt like they didn't have the birth that they dreamed up in their mind. For me, I've had a pretty challenging postpartum. My husband deployed, and I'm like, well, if I got through that labor, I think I can get through anything. So I feel like it was, I was meant to have the birth that I had. But yeah, I think it's important. I know you've had a whole wide array of guests on your podcast share their stories.
Yeah. And I think that you just hit on such an important topic that I could talk on all day. But that idea of our birth experience being I say it's like a microcosm of the macrocosm. The lessons that we learn in our birth are so often the exact ones that we need going forward into motherhood. So when we treat childbirth, not only home birth, but childbirth in general as the rite of passage that it has traditionally and historically been, and we learn to prepare in a way that helps us kind of assimilate and integrate those lessons, then I see us having much more impactful experiences in the whole next phase, which is motherhood. So that's really neat to hear. That's how that has played out for you.
Yeah. And I love, you commented on my post today. Oh my gosh, what was it? Interventions and instincts or something. What was it?
Yeah. The idea that safety lies in instinct, not instruction. Yes. So, and oh gosh, we can totally go into that. But that's not just in terms of having a home birth versus a hospital birth. That's okay, are we truly tapping into our instinct and our intuition, or are we listening to what somebody else is telling us what to do? It's critical. And I'm sure you can already attest, that is a lesson that doesn't end at the end of labor. That is a motherhood lesson.
And it's the most important one. People have asked me for tips postpartum, and I'm like, you just stop talking. Don't ask people questions. There's certain things that are helpful to learn. I just went through a biological sleep course. Very helpful.
Yeah.
We've had some sleep, not nighttime challenges, but daytime, which apparently no one else has. Everyone talks about nighttime sleep. I'm like, the nighttime sleep is great, guys. The nighttime sleep is amazing. The daytime sleep is very hard. But we're working on it, and learning about biological sleep in infants did help me. But ultimately, what I learned from that course was that I need to connect to my intuition more and listen to her. And that's ultimately what helped us with the daytime sleep. So it is always going to be your instincts and intuition, but I love that safety things. I think that's a lot of the questions, a section that we had from people was concerns around safety. But before we get into all that, let's just talk about what home birth is, some of the benefits, and then who can do it. 'Cause that was those were some of the questions we had as well. Is like, well, I was told I can't do a home birth. But what are the benefits in your mind to doing a home birth?
Oh, okay. So a million of them, but we can break it down to just a couple. The first one would just be if you are looking to avoid abdominal surgery, if you are looking to minimize your chance of having a cesarean section. Let's look at those statistics. When we give birth in a hospital setting, our chances of having a C-section are, it depends from hospital to hospital, state to state, but sometimes between that 32 to 36% chance. Whereas if we look at planned home births, whether or not they end in the home or not, the risk is at 5%, which is a lot less. So, I mean, that alone can be a huge encouraging factor for some mothers who are thinking, I want my postpartum to be easier. I don't want to have to recover from surgery while I'm trying to learn how to breastfeed. And of course, not that all C-sections are bad. It's the overuse that is so unfortunate. When they're necessary, thank the Lord for them, but 36% is not necessary. And then another thing that we really need to consider is this idea of satisfaction. When we compare, there's actually a study, it's from the Netherlands, where they're comparing satisfaction rates of our birthing experience between hospital and home. The satisfaction rates of those home birth mothers is drastically higher. And I think that it makes sense when we consider what the midwifery model of care is versus like your traditional obstetric care. You are seen as a whole human being and you are treated as such. You are known, oftentimes very loved by your midwife and your team. You forge true relationships and connection. And then, the typical obstetric model, there's literally not time for that. Like you're in, you're out. You have your appointment. You're usually in the waiting room for most of it. You pee on a stick and then, it's so quick. You oftentimes don't even know who's going to be there at your birth. That's pretty uncomfortable. And in that situation, oftentimes it can feel like birth is happening to you instead of it happening with and for you. So I think that that's a huge, huge thing for us to consider is how our birth experience is impacting our postpartum experience, how our birth experience is impacting our motherhood journey. When we walk into motherhood feeling encouraged and empowered and confident, it's going to be a lot easier than if we feel defeated, beaten down, like something traumatic just happened to us. Not to say that every hospital birth is traumatic, but like I said, those satisfaction rates speak for themselves.
I love that. And I think it's something people don't think about when they think about their own birth experience, but you do want to be happy with the birth that you have if you can. And even if it doesn't go exactly how you planned,
yes,
I think you can still be happy with it if you know how to advocate for yourself and set boundaries and communicate with your providers. And it's so true about the birth team. I still talk to my midwife and one of the birth assistants. So and I'm like, I miss you guys, like,
can we get together? I agree. And I think that you brought up such an important point. It's not about actually the events because no, we cannot control the outcomes. I cannot guarantee you a successful home birth. I can't guarantee you a pain-free home birth, just like you experienced, Amanda. But can you prepare in a way where you feel like you are in control, where you are the number one person on your birth team? Because you have the most responsibility. And I think that sometimes that can be very difficult for us, maybe especially our generation. I'm not sure, but our society as a whole, what have we been taught? We've been taught that, okay, well, doctors know better. They have gone to school for this. They know they're the person. I have to just succumb to whatever it is that they say. And I've experienced this, I went to the ER not too long ago because I thought I was like having an active appendicitis rupture. Turns out it wasn't, and they couldn't even diagnose it, but my myofascial worker got it, guys. Don't worry. But I, as soon as I walked in, I was like, oh, I have to submit to what they say. I let them do things to me that normal Katelyn would never have allowed. And after that experience, it was just a couple hours in there, I turned to my husband and was like, this is why I give birth at home. This is why, because I am not comfortable giving over my power. And so when we realize, hey, it's your responsibility either way. Either you're giving it to somebody else who doesn't have the same desires as you do. Like, nobody's going to care about your birth experience as much as you are. Nobody's going to care about your baby as much as you are. That's just reality. So when we're giving that responsibility over to somebody else, we have to remember it's actually still ours. So it's better if we can take that up and appreciate it and respect that. It's heavy, but it's good. And once again, that's what motherhood is. Motherhood's a pretty responsibility heavy endeavor. So yeah, I think that being able to accept that and prepare in a way that allows us to feel in control of our choices, whether things go 100% smooth sailing or not, that's what's going to lead to those positive outcomes in the end.
I love that. And I love the transition to motherhood. I think that's like probably going to be the biggest takeaway from this episode.
I think so.
So who can have a home birth? Because I think that, there's a lot of questions about concerns and emergencies, and we'll talk about those, but I don't think people realize that like not just anyone, unfortunately, can have a home birth. You do have to qualify to work with a home birth midwife, and it's not just like a set in stone, like you're definitely going to qualify. So can you talk about, like we specifically had a couple people ask about type 1 diabetes and high blood pressure, and would that type of person be eligible for home birth?
Yeah, these are great questions. And I do think that this comes down to like, how are we framing this? How are we framing taking on this responsibility? Because everything really comes down to risk tolerance. Can anybody make you give birth in the hospital? No, they cannot. Nobody can make you do that. Will different factors come into play in terms of whether a midwife is going to feel comfortable working with you or not? Yes, absolutely. But I always want to remind mothers that you have choice. You may not like your choices, but you have choices. So, I mean, there is nothing illegal about giving birth unassisted. Would I personally want to? No, I really like having a skilled and qualified midwife with me. Some moms are happy not to. Can I still go to the hospital and advocate for myself there and have an empowering team with me there? Yes, absolutely. There are definitely ways that we can also work with our midwife one-on-one, and especially when they know that you are someone who is taking responsibility, who's not going to just fling everything onto them and throw them under the bus, at the drop of a hat, then that's really helpful. But yeah, type 1 diabetes is definitely something that a lot of midwives are going to say, you know what, I'm not comfortable with taking you as a client. Others will, though. I have seen so much back and forth about this. Like, I'm in a few midwife groups, and it's a pretty polarizing topic. Some midwives are like, are you kidding me? Absolutely not. That's not safe. And others are like, I have had wonderful success. So it is really it's a care provider to care provider situation. When we talk about hypertension, that's another one that's like, one question would be, okay, well, why is that happening? And is there anything that you can do to get that to be in check? At which, from what I have found, and I'm sure, Amanda, like so much of that can be nutritionally and mineral influenced. So can we work on that before we're entering this time, like in that preconception time? And then, of course, so blood pressure is one of those things, though, that our vital signs really kind of tell a story of what's going on inside of us and what's going on with our baby many times. So that is one of those things that's checked throughout your pregnancy to really check on your body, but also like, okay, well, what's going on with baby? So, every time we go in for a prenatal check, they're going to be checking our blood pressure. So once again, are we able to do things that will keep that within a good range? Are there some outside factors that are influencing that, like stress? So those are definitely questions to ask. But my main point is that, yes, there are things that could prevent you from working with a midwife. But remember, this is all your responsibility. So you have a choice. You can choose to keep searching for different care providers. You can choose to just go to the hospital and have a doula. You can choose to go unassisted. Remember that you hold that responsibility.
And I did have some people reach out saying like I couldn't afford a home birth. And I'm like, I would double check with your insurance because I don't have the most amazing insurance. We have military insurance, just TRICARE, and they covered over half of my home birth. So it's like you really want to, again, like take responsibility, talk with your insurance company, see if like the type of plan. So I had to change the type of plan I was on to get more covered. So I did that research before I got pregnant, if you can. If not, like you could just change it before you go to the doctor for your pregnancy.
Right.
And then the other thing I would consider when I hear doula, I hear a lot of people, I know some people are going to think luxury, right? And I get it. I understand that, and especially right now, like times are tough right now. I know doulas that work on sliding scales, which I think is amazing. I also know doulas that they do a certain number of like free clients a month or a year. Maybe it is probably more accurately a year, depending on how active they are with like home births in the birth community. And it doesn't have to be a home birth, but if I were going to go to a hospital and give birth, I would have a doula that I really trusted with me. And I think that would greatly improve my experience. Of course, also taking responsibility and just learning, what could happen, what could go wrong, what type of interventions might someone want to make. And these are all things you can ask your provider of like, how do they handle certain situations? That could be like a really great thing so that you could be picky with your provider. I know home birth midwives are hard to come by. I get that. I had 3 options, really only 2 because I was too far away for one of them, turned out. So I understand that. I ended up absolutely loving my birth team. So it all worked out. But I think there are options to have an empowered birth and even unmedicated, or even if you choose an epidural, but like still have choice and feel like you're enjoying that birth and have good satisfaction. You just need to do a little research. And if you feel like it's out of your budget, I just really recommend trying to like join Facebook groups for home birth or doulas in your area. That's where I found my birth team, and ask around if you know someone that has had a home birth or had a doula that they liked. And if you can't afford it right away, you got 9 months. So maybe you can save up for it and then talk with them and see if you can work something out. But a lot of doulas just have like the best heart. So
yeah. And it's a few things that you mentioned, I think that are so important. Yes. Checking with your insurance. Also, if you are not pregnant yet and you're considering, health shares are usually really, really good about this. So we have Samaritan Ministries. They cover home birth, like just cover it completely because they recognize like, actually, this saves us a ton of money, guys. Like, I mean, when we compare, like, seriously, compare a hospital bill to a home birth midwife's bill. Like, yes, I understand that one of them you may be paying more out of pocket, but they're charging you like $400 for an Advil, guys. Like it's ridiculous what happens in the hospital. That's not happening when you're working with a midwife. You are literally supporting a small business. You're helping someone who has a heart to serve, but also has to, put food on their table. So I think that it's important to remember that when you're working with an individual, I don't know, it's easier for me to swallow that pill. And then also, we need to remember, okay, yes, I understand that labor is a few hours, a few days at most, but that experience does not just go away. That experience has so much impact on, like we said, on motherhood. The other thing is that you're not going to forget it. You are not going to forget how you felt as your birth was unfolding. And that's because when we go into liminality or like the active stage of labor, we are actually way open and way receptive, like on a subconscious level. So we are just soaking things in like a sponge. And so if we want to walk into motherhood, continue on in our lives feeling confident and empowered, our birthing situation really is important. The people that we're surrounding ourselves with, that really is important stuff. So I know that it is upfront. It can feel like, gosh, this is expensive. Yes, but this is a lifelong investment. This is an investment in your mental health for years and years and years to come. ask moms about their birth experience 20 years down the line. They'll still tell you most of the details. They'll still remember. So keep that in mind. If you have to get scrappy, I would encourage getting scrappy. I know that there have been things in the past where it's like, I really wanted this thing. I want it. It's out of my budget. Like it's totally out of my budget. And I will think like, okay, what can I do to make this happen? What can I sell to make this happen? Like I can get rid of things to make this happen. Midwives typically have payment plans and they will typically be very flexible with you. So don't just count yourself out and be like, oh, well, it's too much. I can't do it. Get scrappy if this is important to you. And as much as I am like I don't want any debt, I will say that would be something that I would go into debt for because I recognize the importance long term.
I mean, also, I can't even tell you how many friends I've gotten that they end up with a huge bill after having a hospital birth. And it's like one of those things that they weren't even anticipating, which makes it way worse, I feel like, mentally, and you just have this brand new baby, so it's a lot. But finances for home birth, I think it's really going to depend on your midwife. I typically, from people I talked to, it was between $5,000 and $6,000. Sometimes it is less. I'm in North Carolina, so it could be different depending on where you are. They all had payment plans, like Katelyn said, and I mean, my friend did a birthing center, and it was like $3,000 more than my home birth. So, which is sad, but
it is. It's also interesting when we think of, I mean, I get it because just the fees for running a birthing center, that's going to be more, but a freestanding birthing center versus a home birth, they're really the same thing. It's just like who's driving where. And I think a lot of times people are like, oh, I'll just feel more comfortable like at a birth center. If you're not attached to, like, if it's not a hospital related thing, it's literally the same thing. I mean, they bring all the same stuff to your house.
Yeah, which we'll talk about, and I don't think people grasp, because I had a few people ask about like the dangers, and I'm like, I don't think you guys know what a home birth midwife is, which is why we're doing this episode. Exactly. And really quick, I will say one of my friends, she did do a birthing center. She loved her experience. She did have to save a lot for it. It cost her a lot of money. They weren't necessarily in a position to do it, but she had a hospital birth for her first birth and did not have a good experience. And she said her house stresses her out. And I was like, that's a very valid point, because she's like, I just didn't like the idea of being at home, because like she'll see stuff around her house, and it's not like a super, she's got a toddler and now she has a new baby, so I get it. So that's something to consider too,
for sure. Yeah, we got to remember that the best place to give birth is the place you feel most comfortable, and the place you feel most open and willing to be vulnerable. That's really what it comes down to, whether that's in your home or at a birthing center or at the hospital. That's what we want.
Yes. And some people do feel that at a hospital, and I think that's great. So let's talk about finding a midwife and team. Do you have any tips for finding a home birth midwife?
Yeah. Okay. Well, so in terms of just like finding options, I highly recommend, if you have like a local kind of like crunchy Facebook group. I know my area has one that is like solid, but they will oftentimes give you the rundown. Like, these are the midwives in our area. This is who we use. We love them, or, whatever it is. So if you can tap into that, like on social media, that's one of the highs of social media, I think, is being able to find those kinds of providers. Also, inside of or on Facebook, we have the Happy Homebirth Podcast community, and a lot of moms will go on, because there are moms from all over. And so if you ask in there, a lot of times there will be people in your area who can give you options. And then in terms of actually like figuring out, okay, here I am, these are the midwives in my area, who should I choose? I think that so much consideration needs to go into this. Now, kind of like what you mentioned, Amanda, depending on where you are, I recognize you may not have the same types of options that I had. It really varies. But one of the things that we really need to do is make sure that we're asking the right questions of these care providers before we even get into relationship with them. We want to make sure, like, okay, does my view of birth, my perception of birth, does it align with yours? Do you view birth as the same physiological process that I do? Or are you more hands-on? Are you going to be like telling me what to do? Those are questions that we need to ask, and you need to, before you even are asking these questions, you need to know your answers. So you need to know what you believe about birth, what's important to you about birth, how you want to be treated, because how I want things to go could be totally different from you, Amanda. What the midwife for you could be one that I'm like, you know what, I don't think so. So we need to know individually what's important to us, so that we can then ask the questions of the midwives we are interviewing to see if we are on the same page. And even if we're not on the exact same page, because spoiler alert, midwives are humans too and have their own opinions, but are we finding someone that that's willing to work with us, that we can have a back and forth and we can find common ground? The other thing that I would certainly want to be knowing is what's going to risk me out of care with you, because that can vary from midwife to midwife. It can vary because of many different things, like regulations, like, certified professional midwives versus certified nurse midwives, or state to state. There are all kinds of different regulations and preferences of midwives. So I want to know, if I reach 42 weeks, are you telling me to go to the hospital and induce, or is there some wiggle room here? Are there things that I can do? Am I going to be required to have an ultrasound, or is that something that I get to choose? All of these different pieces of informed consent, I want to know from my midwife what's going to be okay. Like, are you okay with me pressing decline on everything? Because that's reality for me. So that's pretty important. So making sure that we're asking those kinds of questions at the beginning, not when we're 28 weeks in and are being told oh, you have to take the glucola drink. And you're like, I don't want to. That's not when I want to find that out. I want to find that out before I hire you.
I love that. And I some of the other things that I did ask about, do I have to have any ultrasounds? They just preferred an anatomy scan, but she didn't technically require it.
Right.
And then, which is good to know, right? And in case I changed my mind at the time, we ended up doing it. And then I also asked about breech babies. What happens if the baby's breech? Will you not deliver because I'm doing it, but you know what I mean? Can I still give birth at home? Yes. And then I also asked her C-section rate, because while Katelyn mentioned 5%, my providers was only 2. I'm pretty sure, maybe even less. And things like that, and or what happened, like Katelyn said, is it going to risk you out? Okay, so what if I get a positive test on my gestational diabetes, the glucose test? What happens then? What are the next steps? And it can be really hard to know all these questions at first. Hopefully you guys are taking notes. I know a lot of you do that when you listen. But even if you just go through okay, what are all the things that are, done? I asked about iron and hemoglobin, because hemoglobin is one for home birth where my midwife did not have requirements, but I've had a lot of clients where their midwife had a minimum where hemoglobin had to be. So that's important to know so you can keep an eye on it and intervene sooner, right? Before all of a sudden you're about to give birth but the hemoglobin's not where they want it to be. I mean, I haven't actually seen this happen, but potentially you might not be able to do it at home. So all things that just make a list. I will say that as far as a lot of how you are, as my personality type, we didn't really dig into a lot of that till towards the end when we were making my birth plan. And but my team was cool. They're we just want to make you comfortable and have you feel supported. So if you don't want us to talk to you, we won't. But if you do, we're happy to do that. And I cannot imagine a home birth team that is not like that, but possibly they're out there. So I think those are just really good questions to ask and consider. Let me see. What other one did I have for you? Okay. This was I don't know what your answer is going to be, but someone, and I was like, well, I don't know, just don't do a home birth. But someone asked suggestions for someone without a home birth midwife nearby, to have a positive birth experience. What would you tell them?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And so this is what I have seen. Of course, like I said earlier, it's legal to give birth unassisted. Now, whether that means that you're actually unassisted or whether you have some traditional midwife or traditional birth keeper who's unlicensed, it could be a number of things. Or are you able to travel somewhere else where home birth is, where there is that option? I attended an Airbnb home birth. So you can decide like, all right, obviously there aren't any options here, but like 2 hours away, there are options. So let me get in touch with this midwife and find out if it would be possible to set something like this up. I also interviewed someone on the podcast so she was giving birth like up in I think it was in New Jersey or New York, and they weren't allowed to have a VBAC. And so then she decided to travel to Texas where her family was before she went into labor. And so she had a midwife down in Texas and gave birth there. Yeah. So there really are ways around this if we really want to make it happen. If it's that important to you, there are options. They may not be your favorite options, but there are definitely things to consider. And then, of course, yes, you could certainly just choose to find a supportive team and go for the hospital. I would certainly recommend like, okay, probably you'll want to stay home for a good while if your plan is to make it as much like a home birth as possible. And then also reaching out to those midwives who are further away and saying like, listen, there's nobody in my area. I'm begging you. Can you help me out? There were some clients that my midwife had served that were out in the sticks. I mean, like really, really far out, but they also didn't have a hospital super close by. I mean, they needed care. So you guys deserve care too. So I would certainly be asking those midwives, even if it feels like a stretch, even if they may say no, there is no harm in asking.
Yeah, if I had to do it, if I could not find someone, then even the closest birthing center it's like an over 90-minute drive. I probably would have labored as long as I could at home with a doula that I trusted, and then they would have gone to the hospital with me and my husband and then had that as support. Like, I think that's what I would have ended up doing. So it's like you can, and that's what they tell you to do anyway. They tell you to stay home, so like a part of what they're doing is correct. So, but it can be really hard to do that if you're like, I don't know what's going on. I feel like I really need support. So it's like, have someone that you trust there. Hopefully you can at least have a doula, or maybe a friend that has given birth many times or something. I feel like those people are also just like, they get it and they're like, they can just be there for you. But yeah, I just wasn't sure, but I feel better about that. Cause I was like, I don't know what to tell this woman. Like, I'm so sorry, but it sounds like there are definitely like some options. And just, I think you can control how you are approaching birth for yourself, and your partner. Please make sure your partner's on the same page, cause they are so important.
Yep.
Okay. Prepping for a home birth. This is a whole podcast episode. I realize that, but, how can you prepare for a home birth?
Okay. So obviously, you and I both are very into this idea of education. Like, you need to know what's going on. Now, when we think back to how birth used to happen, the mothers, Cave Woman Amanda didn't need to take a birth class because Cave Woman Amanda was surrounded by her family of women, and you saw birth unfolding consistently. Like, you saw your cousin give birth, you saw your sister and your mom give birth before it was your turn. And there wasn't all of this societal indoctrination about how scary birth is. So we really need to get back to that primal mother, back to that cave woman, Katelyn. And so I highly recommend finding a way to prepare that is not only focusing on just how to get through labor, how to get through your home birth, but actually focusing on, okay, what is this really about? What is this entire experience really about? And what does it mean to me? And how is it going to influence the rest of my life? So yes, we need to be learning what physiological birth is. Sure, I want moms to understand the milestones of labor so that as we're going through it, it feels familiar, even though maybe you've never done it before. I want moms to have coping techniques where they know how to relax, where they know how to release, even in the face of that discomfort or pain. Those are really important things for a childbirth program to cover. However, what I have noticed, and Amanda, we kind of mentioned this, I know you went through Happy Homebirth Academy. I've changed the way that I present childbirth preparation at this point because I do feel like childbirth courses as a whole, that model is just lacking. There's only so much you can do in a few little modules to teach a mother compared to this discussion that is so much deeper of like, okay, well, what defines a successful birth to you, Amanda? Like, what is a successful birth to you? And then discussing like, okay, what role is fear playing in terms of like, what fears do we need to release that are just like totally societal fears versus, okay, is there such a thing as healthy fear and awe? What about boundaries? How do boundaries interact with your birth team, with your spouse, with your future child? I know that I grew up at a time where, boundaries were like not super much a thing in my family. Like I had no understanding of them. And so now learning like, oh, this is how to have safe and healthy boundaries, like very cool. That's super helpful to know as I go into birth. Learning about the nervous system. Oh my gosh. Like if we want to have a birth experience where, like I said, it's happening with and for us as opposed to like, oh, it's just happening to me. Well, that's going to require us to be inside of our body. We need to be safely embodied instead of immediately dissociating. So there are all of these factors. And then in terms of preparing with your spouse, having them involved, just like you alluded to, that is a huge factor in terms of birth satisfaction. I like to say that birth is very magnetizing. And what do magnets do? Like they either repel or they pull together strongly. And so if we're preparing with our spouse, I'm telling you, that pulling together is going to be beautiful and it is going to serve you in this next phase. Adding a new human to your family is like kind of a big deal. And as wonderful as it is, it's a big change. So being together and on the same page is massive. Some other things we need to learn about are, okay, what the heck happens with postpartum? Like, what is that even about? And then intuition and connection. We talked about this with like, this idea of instinct is greater than instruction. Okay, well, that's fine and good, but how do you actually start listening to your intuition? How do you actually connect with this baby that you're growing before you even meet them face to face? These are all the things that like holistically can allow us to confidently step into labor and confidently step into motherhood, as opposed to like, all right, well, I've got these pain relief techniques and I'm going to get through labor, know? So I hope that answers your question.
It does. And I love that idea. And I know that people, and we'll talk about comfort items. Someone asked about that. Mm-hmm. We will talk about that. But I think that people want like a checklist and they'll give you one. Don't worry. Your home birth midwife will give you a checklist of all the things you have to have prepared in your home, all that fun stuff. My husband was on top of that checklist. Thank God. Cause I was like, I'm very pregnant and I'm like trying to prepare for maternity leave and I just have too many things on my plate. So he like did the whole checklist. But you'll get all of that information from your provider. I think this key takeaway of trying to tune in now if you are pregnant or if you want to conceive soon, having that sooner. And I do think this is something that my midwife helped me do. I remember asking her what position the baby was in and she goes, "What position do you think she's in?" And I was like,
"Oh, that's good."
I was like, "I don't know." Like, let me see. And she's like, just take a few minutes and feel around your belly and like, let me know where you think she is. And I was like, wow. And ever after that moment, I always knew where she was, which was really fun and cute. And same thing with like preparing for the actual like birth plan and everything. And they're like, well, what do you think you'd want to do if that came up? And just like, having them reflect back on you, very similar to like if you go see a counselor when they ask you really good questions and they make you think. That's what really helped me like build that intuition when I was still pregnant. And then I honestly think that's where it came from. Like I had this team where they were looking to me. I wasn't looking to them. during my birth.
Oh, that's
And
good.
yeah, so I just think that's how I think people have successful births, or at least
Mhm.
that's how I did. But just like with like someone on their healing journey and like hormone issues or minerals, we want to hand our health over to someone else, right? We
Yeah.
want to outsource it, and I get it because we all have way too much on our plates. But birth is so important. And I
Mhm.
just think that taking that time to think about, what do you want? What kind of birth do you want? Do you feel better with a hospital birth? Do you feel better with a home birth? Do you want to do a birthing center? Maybe you want to have a midwife at a hospital birth, whatever combination it is for you. I just think you have to figure out what that is. And I love that that's like your birth prep. I think that's really just the best advice ever.
Oh, well, thanks. And I do think that one of the things that I've noticed is in terms of social media, in terms of Instagram, home birth, this concept of home birth is now more popular, probably partially because of the pandemic and all of the fallout from the way that the hospital was treating people. And then also because like we're just seeing these pictures, these glorious images of these super peaceful mothers, and they're just like sighing their babies out, and that's wonderful. And that, I mean, my second baby, listen, I was quiet with her. Not that I planned to be, but it was very calm and quiet. My first, I sounded like a beluga whale. So
Me too.
what I want moms to know is that if you are looking at these curated pictures on Instagram and you're thinking that's success, like that is what success looks like, then I want to caution you, because birth is raw. Birth is wild. It is so real and messy and gritty in the best ways. And so if in our mind we're thinking, well, I have to be quiet, I have to look serene, I have to have this very specific aesthetic, and so that I can have a successful birth. Like if that's how we're measuring success, I just caution you, because Amanda, when I look at your pictures and I see the way that you're talking about your birth and saying like, yeah, it was painful and it was intense and it was really hard, like that is actually to me far more appealing. I want to experience it. Like I
Yeah.
want to feel it, and I want other moms to feel empowered by that. I mean, how incredible do you feel now on the other side after experiencing that intensity and then recognizing, oh my gosh, I had the stuff. Like I
Yeah.
had the stuff to get through that. I can take on anything.
Literally. And that's I think that's just it, is that the whole experience, whether it is like amazing and super pleasant and fast. I know I was just like, I don't want to know how long it's been. I wanted nothing to do with time, because the time just like, I knew that was going to get in my head. And I just think, like, again, like you talked about boundaries, it's so important. But just having that knowledge of like, okay, I did this even when I didn't think I could.
Mhm.
Like, it's just, it was very symbolic for how my postpartum has been. So you will have the birth that you're meant to have.
Mhm.
But I still, it's like one of those things where you're just kind of like, well, what do you mean, like, trust your instincts? You will know. If you do
Mhm.
not have people constantly telling you to do things in your ear, if you just get that time, like my husband was with me the whole time, minus when I was in the shower, because I was like, you're too big, get out. You're taking up all of the water. Like the whole time we were together, but like he wasn't really talking to me. He was just there. And that peace and quiet is what allowed me to know exactly what to do. And like you said, we don't grow up seeing birth now. I saw my sister give birth, traumatizing. She ended up having a C-section. I have birth trauma for her. And that is actually why I chose a home birth, because I was like, I can't go to a hospital because I know that I still will, like, so much is going to come up
Yeah.
for me.
Mhm.
And so it's one of those things where we're not seeing it. If you get the opportunity, amazing. But also like just talking to people about their births, and I know they say just hear positive birth stories, and like, yes, but also like we need all birth stories to be
Right.
shared.
Yeah. And what is positive anyway? Like,
Yeah.
I'm sure that like there could be someone who's like, oh, like, but Amanda said the word pain. And so, I don't really want to hear that. It's like, that's a positive birth story. Like you were a warrior and it was amazing. So broadening our concept of what is positive. And that is such a perspective thing. And I feel like so much of this, so much of our birth experience and that transformation into motherhood, that is perspective. That is your mindset. So that is definitely something that you can fortify and work with before you are in labor to prepare. And that will, I talk to my students about like, yes, put on your rose-colored glasses. There is nothing wrong with that. That's why would we? I'm not saying to just bright side, but I'm saying like, why would we not think the best of our experience when that's an option?
And one question for you: how many home births have you had?
2.
Mm-hmm. So when you were preparing for yours, what were things, I mean, probably you knew even more for your second, but what were the things that you were like, I have to have like these items here?
That's a good question. So when I became pregnant with my first, I was actually working as an assistant, a student midwife. So I was attending home births at the time, which was actually very interesting because yes, I had seen a bunch of births. I had seen all variations and knew like, okay, it can be a whole bunch of different things and still be really, really good. But one thing that I will say that I missed out on and my husband missed out on, and we changed dramatically for the second time, was that because I knew what I was doing, my husband thought I had it handled. Like, oh, she's got it. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, this is big. This happens to a lot of people, I think, where the mom is the researcher, like I'm sure a lot of your audience is this way, kind of more on that quote type A style. Like they've got it down. They know what they're doing. They know what they want. So they're in charge of all of the preparation. And the husband's just like, okay, yeah, I support you. But then there's no actual coming together and no actual back and forth and dialogue of like, okay, how are you actually going to support me? How do you actually want to be involved? And how do I want you to be involved? So with my first birth, I will give him the fact that it was a long one. And so for whatever reason, he couldn't stay up for 48 hours straight, but, but like, I felt like there were times where we kind of miscommunicated and missed each other. And it could have been a very strong bonding experience. And not that it was a negative experience, but we just didn't kind of soak all of the nectar out of it that we could have. So with our second birth, I had done a hypnosis based childbirth class for the first. He attended with me. So that's something that I think is important for us to understand. It's not like we weren't doing stuff together, but none of that stuff actually got to the root of like communicating with one another and being there for each other and being on the same page. So the second birth is actually when I started creating resources, because I was like, well, here's all the stuff I, as a student midwife, still didn't know and understand. Like, here's what we really need to be focusing on. So yes, like different comfort items, like warm water for sure is like my fave. I think that is the best. I also like to say, like, what are the things that when you are not feeling well, like obviously birth is not sickness. They're not the same thing, but a lot of the comfort items will be the same. So like, what makes you feel good when you're feeling under the weather? Think about that. And then you can apply that to birth. Do you like to be in the tub? If so, then maybe a water birth is going to be something that you gravitate towards. Do you want someone snuggled up with you and, rubbing your hair? Or do you want someone to like give you some kind words, but actually don't touch me? Those are all, those are things that we can be considering. Not to say that that's always how it works out, but it's a really good way for us to get in the right mindset. I will say though, that when it comes to comfort, when it comes to what did I actually need in that birth experience, I needed to trust myself. I needed confidence. I needed to lean on that intuition so that I could get into whatever weird position my body was telling me to get into, because there's instinct in that. And I needed my husband to be my number one support and for me to feel like we really understood each other. So it's a lot more mental, emotional, spiritual work than it is like, oh, here are the items.
Yes. I love that. And I'm happy you mentioned that. Oh, I just echoed for some reason. Ooh.
I don't hear it on my side.
Okay. I'm sure Will let me know if there's an issue. I too had a hard time like answering that question when people asked me. I was like, oh, just I can hear it. Oh my gosh.
Uh-oh.
1 second. Let me see if there's something I can. I mean, he'll just have to edit it out. We'll see. I also had a hard time answering that question for people because I just needed water and like space. But I will say, like, my husband reminding me to eat and drink was very helpful. And I did not tell him to do that. I mean, he knows how to make like adrenal cocktails and he knows what I like. So like it was easy, but he was like, you really need to eat again. Like, and then like the midwife would kind of like try to get her to eat, and then he would kind of push that. But that was really comforting for me because I was like, oh yeah, I'm like not remembering to feed and nourish myself because I'm just you're just so tuned in. You just don't know what's going on.
Yep. Yeah. And I think that what you're saying totally relates to this idea of, birth is 1/4 physical at most. Like it's so mental, spiritual, emotional. So it makes sense that our preparation would be 3/4, not like, oh, what actual like coping techniques or, what physical items do I need? It's going to be so much deeper than that.
I did like the dark too. I liked it very dark in our room. We set it up that way. We already had like salt lamps and stuff. I got one of my friends, she had a home birth and she had extra like twinkle lights. So she gave me those and we set those up. So that was nice. I would say that's like, but other than that, you don't really need anything. You just need yourself and some nourishment and a really good support system. So let's talk about some of the concerns around home birth and having a baby at home. A lot of the questions were, what is the plan for like a true emergency? Like what happens? I think we probably have to define emergency, but can you talk about that and like the safety around home birth?
For sure. So I think that one thing we need to recognize is the image of the midwife. A lot of times I feel like I've even had people say very specific things like a midwife is like some witchy woman that rides down the mountain on her horse and like walks into your house barefoot. Like not usually. She may not be wearing a bra depending on how fast she had to get there, depending on how fast you were progressing. But these are usually very skilled women. And especially if you are choosing someone who is, holds some type of licensure, has been through some type of apprenticeship and schooling, they are very well trained. And we need to remember also there's so much safety in the way that the midwives model of care works. So you have been getting to know this woman for your entire pregnancy. She knows you. She knows your baby. She knows your baseline normal. Can we say the same thing about obstetrics? Not usually. So when your midwife knows you so well, she can tell when some little red flags are starting to pop up. And that I will say is far more common the way that any type of like transport to the hospital occurs. The vast majority of them are non-emergent. It's like, oh, okay, your blood pressure is spiking. Like, okay, let's try to do some things to change that. Okay, baby's heart rate had a decel for a little bit longer than we prefer. Let's see if we can switch positions. But all of these little tiny things are telling your midwife a story of what's going on with you and what's going on with your baby. So if these things start to vary from what we would consider normal, then we can start to do some things to encourage that to get back to within the range of normal. And if not, then a transport is typically going to be okay, well, why don't we, like, I think it's time, like, let's get in the car and not call the ambulance. Like, let's get in the car. Your husband's going to drive you to the hospital. And, that just seems like the safest place. And that's a conversation that you guys will have. So let's remember, number one, they're extremely skilled. They have a lot of knowledge. They understand who you are. Then usually there's not an emergent transport. It's usually unemergent. It's usually, let's head this off before it becomes something else. very proactive. Now, then I would say the three common things that happen in the home birth setting that would be emergent at some points, but they're also just the most common issues would be a shoulder dystocia, a postpartum hemorrhage, and then neonatal resuscitation. So let's just talk through those very briefly. So when it comes to a shoulder dystocia, we have to remember that there is so much, once again, there is so much safety in instinct, not instruction. And the good thing about when we are giving birth at home is that we can assume whatever positions we need to assume. So if your baby, a shoulder dystocia happens when your baby's head has come out, but the actual shoulders are stuck inside of the pelvis. So it's a bone-to-bone issue. It's not like a bone-to-tissue issue. That rhymed. And so oftentimes, the only thing that needs to be done is a quick positional change. Ina May Gaskin, the Gaskin maneuver is what it's coined, but it's literally just getting into tabletop position. Like, how basic is that? But almost all the time, that is enough to resolve a shoulder dystocia. If you are in the hospital, my question would be, do you think that's what your OB is going to go to first, or are they potentially going to go straight for an episiotomy or a forceps maneuver, all of these different instrumental, more aggressive, intense ideas, as opposed to hey, let's actually just move positions. Midwives understand the pelvis, so we know how to move and manipulate the pelvis to help a baby out. And if that doesn't work, let's say the Gaskin maneuver doesn't work, then a lot of times they're going to have you move one of your legs up into a runner's lunge, and then this, and then that. The thing that's important to know is midwives, it's always continuous movement. All right, we're going to move to this position. Now this one, now this one, now this one, until it's resolved. Whereas at the hospital, it's not oftentimes going to happen that way. You're flat on your back. And especially if there's, medication involved, it's hard to get out of that position. So there's actually a story on the podcast of a mother who did have a shoulder dystocia with her first at home. And she talks about how she's like, thank the Lord I was at home. I'm so glad that I was at home with that shoulder dystocia with my midwife who knew what to do, as opposed to potentially getting an episiotomy, potentially having something far more aggressively managed. The other thing that we need to discuss would be the postpartum hemorrhage. Now, postpartum hemorrhage, it is something that we can do a lot of things naturally first before we're just jumping to medication, which is really wonderful because in the hospital, of course, that's the first thing is going to be medication. And medication is fantastic if it's necessary, but always, there are going to be side effects. There are going to be different ways that's going to influence and affect your body and physiology. So midwives oftentimes do bring a host of different herbs. You can learn about homeopathy and maybe have some Arnica 200C on hand or some Bellis Perennis on hand. There are actually studies that have shown that those, a mixture of those two homeopathics before, during, and after labor are hugely helpful for postpartum bleeding. So that's great to know. And then, so they'll try some herbs. They would try maybe some of that. One thing that I always recommend, I know sounds gross, but it's pretty cool. Our body has so many protective mechanisms inside of it. And simply putting the umbilical cord in your mouth, if the placenta is still attached, can oftentimes slow or stop bleeding. And then if the placenta has already been released, then actually taking a tiny piece of the placenta and putting it in your cheek can slow or stop bleeding as well. I did that personally with my first birth, and my midwife was like, whoa, I am very impressed with how quickly this worked, because the placenta has fibrinogen in it. So that's going to help your blood clot and coagulate. So it's just helping all of the bleeding stop. So there are natural things that we can do. And then after that, should more be needed, then midwives typically carry, or your overseeing doctor or provider would oftentimes prescribe to you Pitocin, which would be injected intramuscularly. That's a great one for stopping bleeding and contracting the uterus down. Cytotec or Metrogen or misoprostol, like all these different ways that are medications to stop bleeding. And depending on how much it is, maybe you will transport to the hospital. Maybe you'll decide, what, I'd like to, have a transfusion or, whatever, maybe just fluids. Or a lot of postpartum hemorrhages are managed at home. So moms will stay home even after that. So that's another one that is a really common concern. But then when we realize, like they actually have ways to help with this. It's not just like, well, you're bleeding, everyone's dying, sorry, goodbye. That's not how it works. And then the final one would be neonatal resuscitation, which is oftentimes like that one would be more common if there were something like a shoulder dystocia or something like that. But it's important to know that some type of stimulation will be needed for a baby, usually 1 out of 10 births. So that's pretty common. So for us to think like, oh no, like this is so bad and this is so dangerous and this is so scary. No, it's not like that. Usually just a little bit of stimulation on the feet, talking to your baby. Maybe your midwife, puts the bag and mask on and gives just like 1 or 2 stimulating puffs of air to help that baby come around. That is usually all that they need. And then something that I think is really important for moms to recognize is that the difference between the hospital dealing with neonatal resuscitation and home is this. In the hospital, that cord to the placenta, to the baby's blood supply and oxygen supply is going to be immediately cut. And the baby is going to be taken away from the only safety that it knows, which is you. And then in the home birth setting, if something like that needs to happen, any type of resuscitative measures are going to be done with you, with the mother, and with the baby connected to its safety line, which is the placenta. So keeping that in mind, like the way that physiologically things need to unfold, it's just like, wow, home birth midwives, like they really get it. So that's really important to recognize. And then of course, like worst case scenario, midwives are trained, like I said, in neonatal resuscitation, but they're also trained in CPR. And if an ambulance were needed, then that is always an option. An ambulance can be called, people can be stabilized, and then we can transport to the hospital. That's okay.
And I love that you brought up like the medications and stuff that they have. Like, yes, they have herbals. My midwife, she had a ton of stuff in her med kit, but they have medications. I think people don't, they're like, what happens if you hemorrhage? I'm like, they have Cytotec. Like that's one of the main ones that my midwife had, and they know how to use it, so I would just keep all that stuff in mind. And I think the other kind of like fear-mongering thing, like a lot of people ask, like, what about family members that are scared? We told my mother-in-law and she almost had a heart attack. And I just personally don't care. I'm like, but I don't really care what people think. So not everyone is like that. And some people's family members have a bigger influence on their life, which I totally understand. But it's one of those things where I'm like, okay, well, if you just don't have the education around what a home birth midwife is and the type of birth team and care that I'll have, when she hears about it now, she's like, that sounds amazing, So I think that you have to make sure that, one, if you're educating yourself or others, it's coming from a home birth expert, preferably a midwife, because if you ask a doctor about these things or a midwife in a hospital, they won't know. I would never do a home birth with a doctor ever, because they're not trained to do that. That's not how they're designed to help support someone give birth. They don't know all the tools, right? So I do think there is a very distinct difference, but that you can have safety in a home birth. It's just like talking to your birth team. They did a whole safety class with me and my husband, and we were both like, man, we feel really good after that. I don't know if every team does that, but those are things you can definitely ask.
And one quick reminder is that the difference between when we're giving birth at home and when we're giving birth at the hospital is it oftentimes comes down to intervention. So are you being poked, prodded, and made to do different things inside of the hospital? Well, then your chances of, needing some type of something postpartum hemorrhage that like super increases, as opposed to being left alone, as opposed to you being the one that's in charge and you working through birth the way that you need to. Your chances of having those things happen are significantly less because you're not being messed with. So that's important to remember. And then when we come over to talking about like, okay, well, what do we do in terms of family? You're right, Amanda. I think that there are kind of two approaches to this. Number one, it's none of their business. Like, it's your medical decision. They don't have to know about it. You don't have to feel obligated to tell people what you're doing. You can. And if you want to, and you want to educate them, then give them all the resources. Send them to the Happy Homebirth podcast. Like, I've got a lot of episodes. I think it's episode 17 was the one that I did that was like Homebirth 101. And it was like a midwife talking through the safety. And then episode 59 is where I'm talking to two midwives and they go over the things that we just talked about in even more depth. You know, the postpartum hemorrhage, the shoulder dystocia, the neonatal resuscitation. That's probably my most sent out episode. And then the other thing for us to talk about, it's something that we touched on earlier, boundaries. If you are having a hard time because you are a people pleaser and you feel like you have to do the thing that your family's telling you to do, well, that tells me that maybe you could focus on the boundaries more so that you don't feel hurt and you don't feel like you have to do something for somebody else. No, this is your experience. This is your transition into motherhood. It's your thing. It's not your mother-in-law's thing. It's not your great Aunt Betty's thing. It's your thing. So make sure you are once again taking that responsibility.
And I'll put those, I just took notes on those 2 episodes, so I'll link those in the show notes. I think those are linked in my birth story one too, but we'll do it again. And getting your spouse on board. A lot of people like, what about my husband? This was hard for me at first, but it was just education. And, you know, he had to not be lazy and he had to listen to the episodes and do some reading. But I was like, this is important to me and this is not something that I'm just going to drop. So it ended up working out. But what advice do you have for moms trying to get their husbands on board?
The first thing that I want to acknowledge is the fact that oftentimes we feel very attacked by our spouse not immediately being on board. And what I want you to remember that a lot of times it is a fear thing because they love you so much. Because the idea of like, what, I'm going to let you give birth at home, like away from a doctor? Like, no way. I love you. I love this baby. I want you safe. So it's fear. It's lack of education. You're right. It comes down to if I provide you reasonably with the information, I feel like rare has it happened that all of the information has actually been provided and that a husband hasn't been like, okay, I see, I understand, especially when they go talk to the midwife, you know, actually ask them all the hard questions. Like, they're the one you're going to be working with and they have been asked these questions before. You're not going to like scare them by asking. But it does come down to like, okay, number one, yes, of course, this is your experience as a mother. Like, you need to feel safe where you're giving birth. And then your spouse, they have an obligation to listen to that and to support you and to genuinely try to understand and to genuinely do the research before just like saying no. I have a discussion that I actually did as we're recording this. So I know this is a few weeks later, but on Instagram, it's called Husbands 5 Things to Consider with Childbirth Education. That is going to kind of talk about why is it actually important to prepare in the first place. And then my birth story with my husband, it's episode 30, goes into this as well. But I do believe that preparation together and actually taking the time to explain why you want this, to explain the benefits, a lot of times it's showing the numbers. Like, give them the research. Like, all you have to type in is home birth safety statistics or home birth safety study, and there will be an article that pops up. It's a MANA, MANA safety study, and it will show all of the research. And it's like, when you look at that, it's kind of hard to say no when you see like, oh, the studies show that it is safe. So yeah, that would be my recommendation. I definitely don't feel like it's worth spending the time and effort on other people, but absolutely working with your husband and working to get on the same page. That's critical.
And I'll put those links in the show notes. I love like the husband's 5 things to consider with childhood education. That's great. So those resources will be there for you, but share why it's important. And I haven't listened to this episode, right?
Yeah.
We answered a lot of like the basic kind of questions. Let's end with postpartum. We had a question about what happens after you give birth with the baby, and like, you're at home. I had a few people that were like, how do they monitor you right after? Because typically in a hospital, you're there for a couple days. So what does that look like when you have a home birth?
Well, I mean, oh darn, you have to like snuggle up in your own bed, in your own sheets, not the sheets of some random stranger with who knows what kind of laundry detergent. Don't get me started. But yeah, you get tucked into your own bed. Your midwife team, they're going to stay for a number of hours after your birth. They're going to do the newborn assessment, which is kind of like the shining moment postpartum for so many people, where you see them do all of these different reflex tests, and then they weigh your baby and measure your baby at such a special time. And all throughout this, they're going to be taking your blood pressure. They're going to be monitoring your vitals to make sure that you're looking good, like nothing is going wrong, nothing's awry. Midwives also are going to leave you, typically, the ones that I've worked with, they leave you with instructions. Usually you have any type of bleeding medication beside your bed and a list of things that you would want to do if you notice that bleeding was increasing. And so they'll say things like rubbing the top of your fundus, urinating, nursing your baby. So they leave you with instructions. And then guess what? They come back. And this is what's so significant and so different from the hospital. Yes, you're in the hospital for 24 hours or 48 hours, but then you're done. Your midwife team should be checking on you every few days and then weeks for up to 6 weeks postpartum, or possibly even further. And I think that that's what's so important to notice, is that you're actually getting longer and more personalized care for longer when you are working with a midwife postpartum. It's not just like okay, goodbye, we'll see you in 6 weeks to tell you whether or not you can have sex again. Like, it's so much more than that. And you do have eyes on you and your baby more consistently.
And it's just that continuity of care. It really is like your whole pregnancy. And I'll tell you what, I mean, depending on what like breastfeeding is like for you, if you have any issues with the baby, I mean, you're going to be tender, right? You're going to be a little, just like fractured. Like, Eliana had ties and like eating issues, and she lost a bunch of weight. I was so stressed out. And if I had to go somewhere with her, and like see someone that didn't know my situation and didn't know me, it would have been very difficult and a huge added stress. So I was like, man, yes, I loved our birth experience, and I'm so happy I had her at home for the actual birth, but it was so nice to be able to stay home. And then, my midwife, she knew, she came like, I had her Wednesday, she came again Friday, and she had lost a little weight, and she's texting me. She's just checking in. The lactation consultant on the team also checking in. She came to see me early because they knew there was an issue, because we were communicating, there's just so many benefits. And even if it's just for the postpartum care, I was like, man, I just felt so comfortable in a time where I was very uncomfortable and like unsure, and a new mom and just like scared. So yeah, I cannot stress like the aftercare is so important.
I love that you mentioned that. And one of my favorite midwife groups, they're out in California. I wish they would move to South Carolina. But anyway, Beautiful One Midwifery. If you guys want to follow them on Instagram, they're so funny, but they are so knowledgeable. One thing that they offer to their community is postpartum care, no matter where you gave birth. So you could have given birth in the hospital, and then they still provide you with postpartum care. I would love to see more of that around the country. That would be huge.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. You're in South Carolina? I did not know that.
Yeah, I think we're just a couple hours apart, I bet.
Where in South Carolina? He can edit this out.
I'm in Greenville.
Okay. So funny.
Yeah.
I thought you were in Colorado for some reason. I have no idea why.
That Colorado look about me.
Oh gosh. I thought I like heard, I don't know, who knows. who knows where that came from. But thank you so much for doing this, Katelyn. I hope that this gives people a little bit more of an idea, like behind the curtain with home birth. I'm going to link to all your podcast episodes. Guys, she has so many episodes and it's all home birth. People wanted me to do a home birth episode and I was like, but there's like a whole podcast already but I get it. I get it. So hopefully now anyone that is interested feels encouraged and checks out those episodes if they want to get a spouse on board. I'm going to link that safety study if you're just still considering things for yourself. But ultimately, you don't have to have a home birth to have a great experience or to feel empowered or to take responsibility. And I just hope that, you guys understand that. But anything you want to leave people with?
Honestly, Amanda, I just want to thank you. I love the information you provide. Like, I honestly, whenever I look at your Instagram, I'm like, how does she do it? Like, it's so much good information. As a podcaster, I feel like I don't have time to listen to a lot of podcasts, but I will make time for yours whenever I see that there's a new episode out because they're always so informative. So I just want to thank you for all that you're doing with the community and for the way that you have been so transparent with your pregnancy, all of the updates that you gave, all of the struggles and wins that you went through. I think that is incredibly beneficial for people to see, like the raw reality of pregnancy and then of home birth and postpartum as well. So I just wanted to thank you.
Thank you. No, I appreciate it. And I think hopefully people know, I just think a lot of people in my community obsess over their health. And it was just really important for them to see that you don't have to have perfect health in order to have a good pregnancy, to have a home birth, to have a good postpartum. We can't control everything, and that's like one thing I was talking about with someone in my membership the other day. She was like, oh, like any like advice for like prepping for home birth. I was like, start surrendering now.
Amen. Seriously, balance of control and surrender is huge. Do what you can, prepare how you can, let the rest fly, baby. Like we gotta be flexible.
Yeah, but it was too funny. But thank you so much for coming on.
It was an honor. Thanks so much, Amanda.